So when we come to modernity and try to understand this period of time and sort of characterize it in our minds, one of the thinkers who often serves as a characterization of this period is René Descartes, the French philosopher from the early to mid 1600s. Descartes really is characterizes for many the spirit of the Enlightenment, the European Enlightenment. He doesn't cause it, he isn't the source of it, but he's one thinker of many thinkers in Europe during the period of the Enlightenment who sort of characterizes or resembles for us, who exemplifies the characteristics of modernity or of the Enlightenment that launches modernity. So Descartes, you'll remember, is this philosopher, French philosopher, who is also a mathematician. He probably, his love in life, we might say, if I were to describe it this way, is mathematics, and particularly the certainty that comes with mathematics. With mathematics, there's no question when you add 2 plus 2, the result is 4. That we have certainty about this. And Descartes was quite interested in really understanding all sorts of disciplines, including religion and faith, Christianity, with this same certainty that he had in mathematics. And the reason for this was that Descartes realized how much in the world, how much around him really was uncertain. There were so many things philosophically, if you set tradition to the side for a moment, which, remember, this is sort of the theme that's coming out of the more radical elements of the Reformation, is this setting aside of tradition. And when you do that with religion, with faith, and set aside the old tradition and encourage people to think for themselves, well, there's a lot of uncertainty that comes with that. And Descartes realized this. He would look at the world around him and talked about this dilemma of, how do we know that the world around us isn't just a dream? This isn't a new dilemma. This is a dilemma that's been around. You can see it all the way back through the Greek philosophers. Plato imagined the world as a dream, all of us living in a cave. And Descartes had a similar kind of thing. How can you distinguish and know that now, your experience now, what you experience and what your senses, even empiricism and what you sense in the world around you, how do you know that those aren't lying to you, that what you're experiencing now? And this dilemma emerges because when you think about the most vivid dream you've ever had, the one where you can jump out of the window and fly around the world, or the most vivid dream you have, there's not a lot to distinguish, or it's maybe even impossible to distinguish between this vivid dream where your senses are even telling you that you're flying, or that the fire next to you is keeping you warm. It's impossible to distinguish what you're experiencing in the dream from what you're experiencing around you right now. So how do I know that this isn't a dream right now, that I'm making YouTube videos in my dreams? I've made YouTube videos in my dreams before. So how do I know? And for Descartes, the solution to this, one of the dictum, the sort of base principle that helped him establish this baseline of certainty, was, I think, therefore I am. In Latin, cogito ergo sum. I think, therefore I am. Ana ufakkir idhan ana, أو عندي وجود, لدي وجود. This dictum, this principle, we talk about it in a number of other courses, and the 4 gifts that this gives us in modernity. The key for us here is the prioritization of rationalism, of the rational thinker. And this prioritization of rationalism and the rational thinker over tradition, revelation, all the other sources of doing theology, even of experience, really radically changes philosophy, thinking, and eventually religious thought and interpretation. The primary rule for interpretation would become from this rational thought. So what thinking and in some disciplines, in some schools, what empirical research and science really can tell us. And those become the primary rule before faith, before doctrine and other things impact how we understand Scripture, or how we understand things that we're trying to interpret. So Descartes sort of resembles for us, or characterizes for us, this school of thinking, this way of thinking that characterizes the Enlightenment and that will impact and shape modernity. So this is a helpful way to get started in thinking about the modern period. In our readings this week, we're going to be reading and starting from kind of a basic overview of this period in church history, or a history of Christianity overview of this. And you'll find that in the reading by Bingham, Jeff Bingham, From Enlightenment to Modernity. And this is a very basic kind of overview. He'll talk about Descartes and some of the major thinkers and theologians during this period, and trace for us this sort of summary overview. This is a really helpful sort of background to understand the dynamics of this period. And then the reading after that is Grant and Tracy, this book, the kind of a simple summary, or a basic summary of a short history of the interpretation of Scripture through history. And Grant and Tracy, there's 3 chapters, they're short chapters, but 3 chapters where they trace the development of interpretation into the modern period, post-Reformation, moving into the modern period. And this is a really helpful, more specific look from church history into the discipline of interpretation of Scripture, where they trace for us the dynamics that we see amongst interpreters during this period of time. And then we have, so those are 2 more broad overviews, and then we have 3 very specific texts. One is a classic text in this field by Hans Frey from 1974. So this is a classic text now on it's from a book called The Eclipse of the Biblical Narrative, where he argues that the overarching story of the doctrinal story of Scripture really becomes subsumed by rationalism and by empiricism during this period of time. And he'll trace that for us in his introduction to this book. So we'll read that, as well as 2 more recent chapters, book chapters by an author named Stanglin and another author named Legaspi. And both of these are very specific texts that trace for us the emergence of what is called the historical critical method, a historical critical exegesis of Scripture. And this is really the interpretive principle that emerges during the period of the modern period, of the period of modernity. Historical critical exegesis becomes the rule for starting to interpret Scripture during this period. When you go to the Bible, how do you understand the nature of this text? How do we understand it and make sense of it and make meaning out of this? And so both of those texts will trace this for us and help us to understand some of the dynamics and offer some examples of different thinkers and interpreters during this period of time who characterize this approach. We'll have some discussion in the forum. Kind of a simple question: where do you see yourself in this discussion? How do you understand it? Where do you see the influence and impact of modernism and this modern interpretive principle that comes to characterize interpretation of Scripture during this period of time, and that influences, we would argue, influences our interpretation today? So we're looking forward to that forum. We'll have some forum discussion around that. It's important to kind of build your discussion in the forum off of those readings. So take some time. The readings are, there's a good chunk of reading, but they're beneficial readings. Through all of this, our goal is to think critically about the nature and dynamics of interpretation in the modern period, to think carefully about it, not negatively critical, but to think carefully and to think about the different sides of responding to the philosophy of the time and trying to make sense of Scripture in light of how people understood the nature of knowledge and the nature of interpretation and nature of understanding during this period of time. And then finally, we'll also have the Zoom chat, which will be focused on the Reformation period. We'll kind of wrap up our thinking and discussion from the Reformation period. We'll have that discussion via Zoom. The link will be in the course, the elements of the course for this week. You'll find that. So looking forward to it, and we'll catch up more in the forum discussion.